Hold up, because this Pooh Shiesty situation just took a turn that almost nobody in rap news is talking about yet. For months, people online have been repeating stories about Pooh Shiesty, his time behind bars, and what his ops allegedly said was really happening when the cameras weren't around. Most people treated it like exactly what you'd expect: rap beef, internet rumors, and people trying to embarrass somebody who wasn't exactly in a position to respond. But now, a correctional officer has entered the conversation, and that changes the temperature completely. Because according to the recent video making the rounds, the officer discusses a timeline connected to Pooh Shiesty's incarceration that people are now comparing with claims that were already circulating. And this is where you need to pay attention. That does not automatically mean every wild story his ops told was true. Don't let anybody sell you that shortcut. The interesting part is the timing. Certain claims were being thrown around before this latest update ever surfaced. Now people are going back, replaying old statements, comparing dates, and asking whether everybody dismissed something way too quickly. And there's another twist nobody seems to be asking about. Why is this information becoming a conversation now? Because if the timeline in that video checks out, this story isn't really about another rapper getting exposed. It's about whether one new account just changed how people are looking at an old story. And once you see what was allegedly said, and what can actually be verified, the difference between the two gets crazy. Here is where the Pooh Shiesty story gets a whole lot more interesting, because the conversation is no longer just about what somebody said during a rap beef. The internet has heard allegations, jokes, threats, and disrespect aimed at Pooh Shiesty before. But this correctional officer video has people looking backward instead of moving forward. People are now comparing the officer's account and timeline with older claims made by Shiesty's opponents, trying to figure out whether there is actually a connection or whether the internet is forcing two separate stories together. A correctional officer discussing events does not automatically prove every allegation people made about Pooh Shiesty. Because this story gets more interesting when you separate what can be supported from what people simply want to believe. What makes this situation hit differently is that Pooh Shiesty has not been controlling the conversation. When an artist is incarcerated, everybody else gets room to build a story around him. Rivals can talk. Bloggers can speculate. A 5-second statement can become a 30-minute debate, and once millions of people hear the same version enough times, rumor starts sounding like history. That is why this correctional officer clip is getting attention. Viewers are not only listening to what is being discussed, they are studying when events allegedly happened and comparing that timeline with statements that were already floating around. Old comments that sounded like ordinary trolling are being pulled back onto the screen. People are saying, "Wait a second, when was that originally said? When did this supposed incident happen? Who knew what? And when could they realistically have known it?" Because timelines can expose exaggerations just as easily as they can make an old allegation look more interesting. If the dates do not line up, the viral narrative falls apart. If they do line up, then people naturally start asking where the original information came from. And then comes the detail that could completely change how you look at the entire situation: the source itself. A correctional officer carries a different kind of perceived credibility than a rapper throwing insults during a feud, but that does not mean viewers should automatically treat every statement in a viral clip as an official prison record. Context matters. Was the officer speaking from direct knowledge? Was the officer repeating something heard from somebody else? Is the clip complete, or are viewers watching a section removed from a longer conversation? Those are the questions that separate actual reporting from entertainment dressed up as reporting. And right now, the internet is doing what it always does when a story involves a famous rapper, racing toward the craziest possible conclusion before checking the boring details that might actually decide what happened. But here is the unexpected turn. Even if the officer's timeline does not prove the most extreme things Shiesty's opponents have claimed, the fact that people can now compare a newer account against older statements creates a completely different conversation. It means the story is no longer simply, did his opponents make something up? The question becomes, which specific details were said first, which details appeared later, and which ones can independently be verified. That is where this gets dangerous for anybody trying to manipulate the narrative, because receipts have a funny way of ruining a perfect internet story. Dates matter. Full clips matter. Exact words matter. And if somebody changed their story after new information became public, that matters too. So do not get distracted by thumbnails screaming that Pooh Shiesty was exposed before seeing what the officer actually said in full. The real bombshell may not be the allegation everybody is repeating. It may be the timeline hiding underneath it. Because if one detail from this recent update matches something said long before the public had access to that information, then there is an obvious question nobody can dodge. How did they know? And if it does not match, somebody has been selling the internet a story that sounds much cleaner than the evidence really is. Either possibility makes the next piece of this story much bigger than another day of rap gossip. Now here is where people are starting to miss the bigger picture, because once the correctional officer entered this conversation, everybody immediately wanted a simple answer. They wanted somebody to say the rumors were true or the rumors were false. But real stories rarely work that cleanly, especially when you are dealing with prison information, old rap beef, edited videos, and people online who already decided what they wanted to believe before hearing the evidence. What matters now is not who can make the wildest claim about Pooh Shiesty. What matters is whether the timeline being discussed can actually survive scrutiny. And that is exactly why people are digging through older videos, old interviews, social media posts, and statements from people who previously had something to say about Shiesty. They are looking for one thing: consistency. Because if somebody described a specific event before information about that event became publicly available, that raises questions. But if the details only appeared after rumors were already everywhere, then suddenly that supposed prediction does not look nearly as impressive. That distinction might sound small, but it could determine how this entire story should be understood. And there is another angle here that almost nobody wants to discuss. Prison stories are incredibly easy to exaggerate because the public cannot simply walk inside and verify what happened. Think about that. If somebody makes a crazy allegation about something happening at a concert, there could be hundreds of phones recording from different angles. If something allegedly happens inside a correctional facility, access is completely different. That information can move through inmates, employees, relatives, attorneys, paperwork, phone conversations, and eventually social media, sometimes changing every time another person repeats it. By the time the story reaches the public, one sentence can have 5 different versions attached to it. That is why the correctional officer's exact wording matters more than whatever caption somebody puts above the video. A viral headline might say one thing, while the actual speaker could be saying something far more limited. And if you only watch the headline, congratulations, somebody else just decided what you believe before you even heard the evidence. But Pooh Shiesty is not just some random name caught inside a prison rumor. His reputation is connected to an image that fans have debated since his rise in rap, which means anything involving his name instantly becomes ammunition. Supporters want to defend him. Opponents want the most embarrassing interpretation possible. Content pages want the version people cannot resist clicking. That creates the perfect environment for one uncertain detail to become a supposed fact overnight. And this is exactly where smart viewers should become suspicious, because the louder everybody gets, the more important the quiet details become. Who originally made the claim? When was it made? What exactly did that person say? What did the officer actually confirm from personal knowledge, if anything? And which pieces are being added by people reacting afterward? Those questions are not nearly as exciting as screaming that somebody got exposed, but those questions are how you find out whether there is actually an exposure in the first place. Now watch the timeline closely, because this is where the story could flip again. If older statements from Shiesty's opponents contained specific details that genuinely appeared before those details were publicly available, then people are going to demand an explanation for how that information traveled outside. That still would not automatically prove every accusation attached to those statements, but it would make the source of the information worth examining. On the other hand, if the correctional officer's comments are being stretched beyond what was actually said, then the so-called confirmation could disappear the moment you hear the full context. That is the possibility nobody making dramatic thumbnails wants to advertise. Sometimes the biggest twist in an exposure is discovering that the exposure itself was exaggerated. And that brings us to the question hanging over this entire situation. Why did this particular clip suddenly gain attention now? Something can exist online for days, weeks, or even longer before one account reposts it with the right caption and suddenly everybody acts like it happened 5 minutes ago. That is why upload dates, original sources, and complete footage matter. Because if people are comparing two statements, you need to know which statement actually came first. Otherwise, there is no timeline, there is just content. And once you start separating the content from the chronology, this Pooh Shiesty story becomes much more complicated than the headline suggests. Somebody may have known something early, somebody may have repeated information later, or the internet may be connecting details that were never connected at all. But there is one clue inside this timeline that could tell us which explanation makes the most sense, and that clue is exactly where the story takes another unexpected turn. And that clue is where people need to stop watching this story like regular celebrity drama, because information coming out of a correctional facility does not move the same way information moves on the street. There can be a huge gap between when something allegedly happens, when somebody first hears about it, and when the public finally sees a video discussing it. That gap is exactly where rumors grow. One person hears a detail, another person adds context, somebody posts a cryptic message, and suddenly thousands of viewers believe they know the entire story. But when you put those statements beside an actual timeline, things can start looking very different. That is why the recent correctional officer video has created so much conversation around Pooh Shiesty. It gives viewers another account to examine, but it still does not mean every claim attached to his name has suddenly been proven. The real question is narrower and much more interesting. Does anything in this newer account independently match specific information that appeared earlier? Because imagine discovering that the most viral allegation is not even the most important detail. Imagine everybody arguing over one embarrassing rumor, while the timeline reveals something completely different about how information was traveling. That would change the story from simple rap beef into a question about who had access to what information and when. And that is where the internet detectives have to be careful. Similar stories are not automatically the same story. Two people mentioning an incident does not prove they witnessed the same thing. Two dates being close together does not establish a connection. If you want to call something confirmation, the details have to match in a meaningful way. Otherwise, you are taking separate puzzle pieces and forcing them together because the finished picture would make a better thumbnail. There is also something else happening here that deserves attention. Pooh Shiesty's name creates engagement before anybody even explains the story. The moment people see words like exposed, correctional officer, prison, and ops in the same headline, curiosity does the rest. People click because they expect a devastating revelation. Then the comments start filling up before viewers even reach the end of the video. One side says they always knew the rumors were true. The other side says everybody is lying on Shiesty. But both reactions can make the same mistake, deciding the conclusion before establishing what the officer actually knew. That is why the complete context matters more than the reaction. If the officer personally witnessed something, that would carry one meaning. If the officer learned about it secondhand, that is different. And if people online are interpreting a general statement as confirmation of a very specific allegation, that is different again. Now here is where the pressure shifts toward the people who originally made those claims. If they really had accurate information before everybody else, the timeline should help them, not hurt them. Their original statements should exist with dates. Their details should remain consistent. They should not need to rewrite what they meant after seeing newer information. But if old claims suddenly start changing so they fit the correctional officer's account, that is something viewers should notice immediately. You cannot move the goalposts and then call it a prediction. Either somebody knew a specific detail beforehand or they did not. And this is why archived posts, complete interviews, and original upload dates become more valuable than somebody yelling over a reposted clip. The internet remembers almost everything, and sometimes the timestamp is more revealing than the person speaking. But there is another possibility, and this one might be even more uncomfortable for everybody involved. What if either side has the complete story? What if Shiesty's opponents heard fragments of something real but exaggerated what those fragments meant? What if the correctional officer is discussing an event that sounds similar but is not actually the event people online are connecting it to? That would explain why certain details appear to line up while other details remain unclear. And suddenly the story stops being about choosing between two sides. It becomes about separating the small amount of information that can be supported from the enormous amount of speculation built around it. That distinction matters because once an allegation becomes attached to somebody's name online, correcting it later is almost impossible. The sensational version travels faster than the clarification every single time. So before anybody declares Pooh Shiesty officially exposed, there is still one major question that has to be answered. What exactly can be traced back to the correctional officer's own knowledge, and what was added afterward by social media? Because when you separate those two things, one detail starts standing out, and it could completely change who actually controlled this narrative from the beginning. And once you ask who controlled the narrative from the beginning, the entire situation starts looking different, because the first person to tell a story is not necessarily the person who knows the most. They are simply the person who got their version in front of the public first. That matters in rap culture, where one viral clip can establish a reputation before anybody gets a chance to challenge it. With Pooh Shiesty, people already had strong opinions before this correctional officer video started circulating. Some viewers were ready to believe anything negative because it matched what they had already heard. Others were ready to reject everything because they support Shiesty. But neither reaction answers the question that matters: what information can actually be traced to a reliable source? That is where this story becomes less about choosing sides and more about understanding how a claim becomes accepted as fact online. Look at how quickly the language changes when a story goes viral. Somebody begins by saying they heard something happened. Another account reposts it and says something allegedly happened. Then another page removes the word allegedly and suddenly announces that it happened. By the fifth repost, people are arguing over the event like they personally watched it happen. That progression is important here because a correctional officer appearing in the conversation can make every previous rumor look more credible than it actually is. People hear the words correctional officer and immediately assume official confirmation. But those are two completely different things. An officer can discuss a timeline without confirming every allegation attached to that timeline. An officer can know one detail without knowing another. And unless the complete statement clearly establishes direct knowledge, viewers still have to separate what was actually said from what social media decided it meant. Now think about what happens when Shiesty's opponents get added back into the equation. Their old statements suddenly become valuable content again. Clips that might have disappeared months ago can be reposted with captions claiming they predicted everything. But prediction is a strong word. For an old statement to truly become significant, it needs specificity. Saying something vague happened behind bars is not the same as describing a specific event, date, location, or circumstance before that information became public. That is why the timestamps matter so much. If the details were vague originally and only became specific after the officer's video appeared, viewers should notice that. But if a highly specific detail can genuinely be traced back to an earlier statement, then the obvious question becomes where that information came from. Either way, the timeline tells you more than the loudest person reacting to it. And this is where another uncomfortable possibility enters the story. What if the people spreading the original claims had access to somebody who was communicating with people inside? That would not prove the claims themselves, but it could explain why certain information appeared outside before the wider public heard about it. Information does not stay trapped behind prison walls. Calls happen. Messages move through families and legal channels. People hear things from other people. Stories travel. And every time a story passes through another person, details can change. One small incident can become something completely different after enough retellings. So even if somebody knew about an event early, that does not necessarily mean their interpretation of that event was accurate. Knowing that something happened and knowing exactly what happened are not the same thing. That distinction could be the key to everything people are arguing about right now. Maybe there is a real event underneath all the noise, but the internet version has been exaggerated beyond recognition. Maybe separate incidents have been combined into one story. Maybe an old statement happened to sound similar to something discussed later. Or maybe there really is a detail in the timeline that deserves closer examination. Until the original material is compared carefully, every one of those possibilities remains on the table. And that is exactly why anybody telling you the entire mystery has already been solved is moving faster than the evidence. Because the most revealing moment may not be something dramatic, the officer says. It could be something much smaller, a date, a sequence of events, or a detail that appears in one account but not another. Those tiny inconsistencies are where stories either become stronger or start falling apart. And if one version of this story changed after the correctional officer video surfaced, then the question is no longer simply whether Pooh Shiesty was exposed. The question becomes whether somebody used a real piece of information to sell a much bigger allegation. That difference is massive, because one can be documented while the other might be pure interpretation. And when you trace the timeline back far enough, there is another question waiting that almost nobody seems to be asking. Who actually introduced the crucial detail first? So now I want to hear from you, because this is where the story stops being about what the internet wants you to believe and starts being about what the timeline can actually support. Do you think the correctional officer's account gives real weight to anything Pooh Shiesty's opponents were saying before, or do you think people are taking one piece of information and stretching it into a completely different story? Drop your answer in the comments, because I already know people are going to be divided on this one. And before you comment, remember one thing: confirmation and coincidence are not the same thing. If somebody had specific information before it became public, that deserves attention. But if people are changing old claims after new information appears, that deserves attention too. So tell me what you think matters more here: the officer's account, the original timestamps, or what Shiesty's opponents claimed first. If you want more rap stories where we actually follow the timeline instead of repeating whatever headline is trending, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there are details in stories like this that disappear once everybody starts chasing the viral version. And trust me, you are going to want to stay locked in on this situation, because if another statement, original clip, or documented timeline surfaces, the entire conversation around Pooh Shiesty could change again. So subscribe, keep your eyes on the receipts, and remember, in rap news, the loudest story is not always the real story. Sometimes the timestamp tells you everything.